Hello. In this segment, we are going to discuss inductive argument. Now, the last section, we talked about deductive argument, and it has a pretty straightforward structure in which you deduce the conclusion from the premises. You can say, all men are mortal. Socrates is a man. What may you conclude? Socrates is mortal. In inductive arguments, we induce or infer the conclusion from the premises, so that the premises don't so much prove the conclusion as they strongly suggest it. For example, you have this premise: every dog that has ever died has stayed that way. Conclusion: my dead dog Mortimer won't be back. Now, it's an interesting element of modern philosophy that goes back to a 18th century Scottish thinker named David Hume, who made the argument, and it really had to do with what we can know about what is a cause. How do we know what is a cause of something? And he concluded that just because the sun has come up every day in the past does not logically prove that the sun will come up tomorrow. In other words, Hume argued there is no logical error in assuming that the sun might not come up tomorrow. So just as I conclude that my dead dog Mortimer is not coming back to life, if he did, no logical error would have been committed. Let's look at a more complex example taken from the story of Sherlock Holmes. In A Study in Scarlet, readers are introduced to Dr. Watson, where he meets Sherlock for the first time in London. When they meet, Holmes tells Watson that he believes him to be an army doctor just back from Afghanistan. In the discussion that follows, Holmes explains how he came to this conclusion. Quote, "Here is a gentleman of the medical type, but with the air of a military man. Clearly an army doctor then. He has just come from the tropics, for his face is dark, and that is not his natural tint of skin because his wrists are fair. He has undergone hardship and sickness, as his haggard face clearly shows. His left arm has been injured. He holds it in a stiff and unnatural manner. Where in the tropics could an English army doctor have seen much hardship and got his arm wounded? Clearly in Afghanistan." End quote. The observations and conclusions are not framed in standard form or deductive form, because the arguments are not deductive, drawing conclusions from the literal meaning of the premises, but we shall list them in turn. First, Holmes notes that the man he is describing is a medical type with military bearing and concludes that he is an army doctor. So you can see how this is working. He's obviously not a professional swimmer or something. This man has a certain kind of appearance that suggests what he does. Second, he has probably recently returned from the tropics because the skin on his face is darker than on his wrists, suggesting exposure to sunlight. Third, the doctor has gone through sickness and hardship, as we might judge from the haggard look on his face. Fourth, the man holds his arm in a stiff and unnatural way, indicating that he has been wounded or injured in some other way. Finally, Holmes wonders where in the tropics an English army doctor would experience hardship and injury, and concludes that it must be Afghanistan. Now note that in each of these observations and conclusions, Holmes could be wrong. But it's likely that he's right. In other words, where the connection of the conclusion to the premise is close, that argument is called strong rather than valid. Where the connection is not close, that argument is called weak. So in deductive arguments, you have sound arguments, which are valid and true. In inductive arguments, you have strong arguments in which we have a high degree of reliability in the conclusion based on the premise, but not what we would call logical proof. We have seen that what are deductive and inductive arguments and what makes them valid, deduction, or strong, induction, or invalid and weak. We will next examine what are called fallacies of reason. We will consider those errors of thinking that we see most often. In practical reason, we need to be able to make well-formed arguments, but we need also to be able to spot bad arguments.